Welcome to our LB's The Lover of Books author chat. If this is your first time here or watching a recording, I'm so glad you found us. I've had the honor to interview over 90 debut to best-selling authors, and readers like you have helped my YouTube channel grow. That's LB The Lover of Books, and y'all, it's over 31,000 hours watched. So thank y'all so much. I appreciate you taking the time to like and comment and definitely subscribe. Keep telling more readers about all these great author chats and invite them to come along. Now, I want to introduce you to our most recent LB author. Alice Austen won the John Cassavetes Award for her debut film, Give Me Liberty. She's the writer and producer. She is a past resident of the Royal Court Theatre, and her international produced plays include Animal Farm, the Steppenwolf Theatre, Cherry Orchard Massacre, and Girls in the Boat. She studied creative writing under Seamus Heaney at Harvard, where she received her JD, after which she moved to Brussels and lived on Place Brugmann. Austen currently lives in Milwaukee and is working on a new film and her next novel. Welcome, Alice. Thank you so much for coming.
Thank you. It's such a pleasure.
Well, I'm just going to say that your bio is so wide. Like it is all over, which I absolutely adore. And I'm not even quite sure where to start. But I mean, I just said that you had a debut film out, and I know we're here to talk about your book, but I have to address this. Like, tell us more about this and how this fits into your world.
Well, it's interesting because I will say I started as a fiction writer, and that was like the objective. And then I've had a very interesting path in the process of my sort of, I guess, writing career. I became a Chicago playwright, which was also completely accidental. I wrote my first play on a bet in Brussels with Irish actors in a pub, and the play was produced. And then they weren't cast, which was like a brilliant introduction to theater politics. But then I went to Chicago, and Martha Lavey, who was then the longtime artistic director of the Steppenwolf, read a play, and she was like, "Oh, this is really good." And I became a Chicago playwright. And I actually constantly was giving myself a crash course in theater because I didn't study theater. And I'd read a lot of plays, and I studied English literature, and I'd read Shakespeare, but I ended up teaching the master class in playwriting in Chicago, and I would always teach plays I hadn't read because I was constantly, catching up. And then, um, and then I started working in film, and I founded a film company with a Russian-born director, Kirill Mikanovsky, and we made a film. We made one film, and then we made another film that went to Cannes, and it was called Give Me Liberty, and was distributed worldwide and seen at film festivals around the world, and won the Cassavetes Award. So it was kind of amazing. And we are right now kind of on tenterhooks, waiting to hear from an actor. I won't say who we've got for another film that we've got cast, but we need to cast the male lead that we're hoping to shoot this year. And I have a film that is actually going forward in France right now that I wrote that's a long time project. So I continue to work in film, and it definitely has informed my fiction writing in
Okay.
a lot of
This
ways.
mysterious actor, can you tell us what the name of the film is so that we can keep our ears out for when more
The
news
film,
comes?
well, right now the working title is "How's Your Shoulder, Eddie?" So we'll see. We'll see.
Okay.
Well, these titles they tend to change. You get your title, and if it's not quite right, you're like,
Yeah.
massaging it, and then sometimes they change in another language, and then you're like, what? Wait, what?
Yeah.
That's what they're calling it. So.
Okay, so you start off thinking you're going to write fiction. You end up in a screenplay, film world. How did you end up back to writing this particular novel?
So I was writing fiction all along, and then there was a point this story had sort of been with me for a long time, and I
Awesome.
I felt like it was such an interesting story, and I had thought about writing it. I thought about writing it as a play. Unfortunately, American theater started losing a lot of funding. And at the point I was thinking, well, I might be able to do this. I was working with, these wonderful theaters in Chicago and New York and in England. Theater funding kind of dropped, and artistic directors would say, well, do you have a two-hander? Or maybe we could have three actors, but one would double. And so I thought, well, that won't work because this has a lot of characters in there. That's the levels of the house, and that really matters. And there's no
Mhm.
way a theater's going to afford to build a house with all those, it just didn't work. So I decided to write it as a work of fiction. And initially I was going to write it in a very simple way as a novella with one narrator, and it that wasn't right. So this was
Okay,
a book
wait.
I really yeah.
Who was the one narrator then? I just have to ask.
Uh well, I mean originally it was Charlotte.
Okay, that would have been my guess.
Yeah,
I
yeah.
wanted to find
Yeah.
out. Okay, keep going. Novella, Charlotte moved past
Yes,
that.
and the thing is I had heard these stories when I lived in the apartment and in the building. And they were funny. There was a lot of humor. The Belgians have great sense of humor. And also they were so full of suspense. And I was imagining living there in that time, knowing that you had neighbors who were Nazis, you had neighbors who were collaborators, but sort of you didn't know who they were, but you knew kind of that they were collaborating. Maybe there was someone else who was part of this network of individuals who were helping RAF servicemen and Jewish families escape. And and you really didn't know who was doing what.
Okay,
And yet actually yes.
how did you end up? I feel like we've like just jumped.
Yeah.
How did you end up in this house in Brussels? I mean, you've been talking about films and Chicago and all the things. So I gotta know, like, how did this happen?
Well, so I went to law school and
Okay.
um and I did creative writing under Seamus Heaney while I was there, and then I did human rights work. And I ended up being the first American who was a fellow at the European Court of Human Rights in Strasbourg. And I founded the Harvard Human Rights Journal with two classmates and a professor. And then I went on to ultimately do international work where I was helping, and it's very moving to me right now, given all the things that are happening in Europe and how dire a time it is. But we're helping the former Soviet republics establish democratic governments and privatize. So I worked for Václav Havel's government in Prague and in Czech. And we were in Brussels. My husband and I were living in Brussels, and I was commuting to Prague. I worked in Hungary. Actually, I was so moved when the election turned out so well a few months ago. It's incredible because I actually did, I was writing a lot of laws for these different countries, and it was a time of such hope and expectation. And it's, I see what's happened in Ukraine, and that's also I wrote at one point the legal code for Ukraine as it was emerging from this time of Soviet control. And so it's like shocking to see where we are now because everyone thought it was the end of fascism. It was the end of totalitarianism. It was like the future was so golden. So,
Okay, so you're in Brussels because
yes.
you're doing this legal work, but you end up in this historical building with all these stories and mysteries and humor, like you said. Um, and is this just part of your everyday life, sort of coming into now your fiction writing?
Well, so it was really an interesting process because we had another apartment and then we decided we wanted to stay. We really liked living there. We wanted to stay a lot, like indefinitely. And so we were looking for an apartment, and a friend of mine Marie-Therese Rainey said, "Oh, there's a flat on Place Brugmann. Quick." Because it was a very desirable part of town. It's beautiful. It's got this avenue of trees leading up to it, and this church, which is kind of ugly in the middle, but it's a beautiful square. And so we took the flat right away. And it was actually Charlotte's apartment. It's like in the book, although I took literary license and I removed a floor from the building. It's another floor, but I couldn't deal with that many characters. So, but In the building, there were two elderly women who had lived there. One had lived there through the occupation. The other had gone away and come back. And my first child was born. My oldest son was born when we lived in the building. And like baby Charlotte, he had colic. He had terrible colic. And you could hear everything in the building. You could hear every single sound. So all of that is true, which made the stories these ladies told me and what I knew had gone on during the occupation so much more potent because I thought, my God, how did they deal with a circumstance where, okay, if you're a collaborator or if you're a freedom fighter and you're living in the same building, how do you hide that from your neighbors who really hear everything? And that to me was the remarkably suspenseful part of the story. And also the fact that in a time like that, you really depend on your neighbors. And what if your neighbors are, doing things that actively endanger you?
All right, you think of people around you being like-minded in a lot of ways, not
Right.
across the hall, someone completely opposite of your values and thought system. So that is absolutely fascinating. So you now have this baby in Brussels. You have a colicky baby on top of that, and you
Yeah.
have these women telling you stories from the past. So how did you decide to move forward? Was this something that was just percolating and you wanted to write it down, or did you always know that this was going to be something?
I always knew it was going to be something. It was the form and the timing. And then I think, it was right around COVID when it seemed so potent and relevant because, during COVID, our world shrank so much. And all of a sudden, our immediate, a lot of people didn't even know their neighbors before there were lockdowns. They would just, live in their place and go to work and do what they did. And all of a sudden, your immediate environment became so critical. And in a way, an occupation is a lot like a lockdown. And then, of course, we're in a much less peaceful time in the world, and a lot of people live in difficult circumstances. There are a lot more wars. There are occupations. There are these circumstances, and your neighbors and your immediate milieu becomes all important because sometimes that's kind of all you have. And so it seemed really urgent to write the book.
So you're writing it not even knowing what the form is going to be. So how does your brain work in that? Does it process information and get the words out the same and then you can adapt it into the format you want? Or does the
Well,
format sort
it's,
of,
I decided I'd write it as a book. And
okay.
I started with this one narrative voice, and that didn't work. It wasn't right. And then I tried an omniscient narrative voice. And that just felt far too sort of, well, let me tell you how it is, and kind of heavy
No.
and a little bit old-fashioned in the wrong way for this novel because I wanted it to feel very present. And so that was when I hit upon using writing it from the point of view of each character. It also gave me an opportunity to let the characters really have their freedom and sort of decide their paths. And I had the great good fortune to work with a very wonderful and famous Cuban, but she lived in America for a long time, director and writer and dramaturg Maria Irina Fornes, who's very sadly no longer with us. And she gave me this extraordinary advice that you put your characters in motion and then you watch them and you watch them move and you see what they do. And I started letting my characters act. And I had a roadmap for what some of them would do, and they flouted it. They did other things. And that was fascinating to me. I was just like very, very surprised. And it made the writing a lot of fun.
Which character did the most about face for you?
Oh, I think Dirk.
We're definitely going to get to Dirk. I want to say I have quite a bit to ask about him, but I just want to keep up the part of the setup before we move into deeper into this novel. You decided it's going to be multicast, but you do have to decide who the characters are going to be. It sounds like
Mhm.
some of it may have already been decided a little bit by the stories that these two women were telling. But how did you make that decision? Like, I want Charlotte's voice. I also want Julian's voice? Like how did you make those decisions, or was
Well,
that
that was a very interesting process because they're all fictional. And
right?
there was a broad, there were a couple of things that happened, and those things are generally kind of represented in the book. But other than that, they're all fictional characters. So sometimes they sort of presented themselves. Like Masha sort of appeared in the attic. And I was like, oh, I love Masha. That was very interesting to me. And then the Raphael family took shape. And Leo, I felt I understood and knew very well. And so I was really easily able to get into Leo's head. And Julian, actually, one of my sons did the tripos at Cambridge. So when I gave him a book, I said, only you will know if I got the math bits right. So there were like different elements that sort of came into the novel, and it was again a very sort of fluid process. I did eliminate a couple of characters as I went. There was one in particular I sort of had an affection for, but she didn't add a lot to the plot. She really didn't add a lot to the plot. And also, she was more based on someone who had been in the building and a story that had been in the building that I really was a little bit reticent to tell for a number of reasons. And then my agent and my editor both said, do we need her? Like, does she really? And I knew she had to go.
Yeah.
And I didn't feel, I think there's this very interesting process for a writer. The editing process is interesting. And I've gone through this in theater. There's so many workshops, and then you work with actors and then audiences. And as a writer, you must learn to hold on to what you know is the soul of the work. And that's the thing you have to hold on to for dear life. And you also have to listen. I've worked with Alfonso Cuarón on a project, and he and Inarritu and like they always workshop each other's films. They watch each other's films and weigh in on them. And he told this great story about thinking that you know he was wrong, and no, 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 and he went to bed and he was like, no, he's wrong, and then he cut up the next morning and he was like, he's right, I have to cut that. And I think you find your people who you trust. And I have a reader who's based in LA who's an extraordinary writer herself. She won the Saturday Evening Post fiction competition, and her name is Linda Davis, and she has a wonderful collection of short stories that I think will be published soon. And she's wonderful. She's very direct. She gives me really great input, and I treasure that, because you need people who tell you, who are honest
Hmm.
and also understand what you're trying to do.
Yeah. Well intended. All right. So you have these actors in the book as characters almost moving about the page. I know you said you got into Leo's head pretty easily. Were there some characters that were harder for you that you had to work a little bit more, or just change your way of thinking to make them come alive on the page?
Well, one thing that was really interesting to me is that when I wrote it from the first person, so I was in their head, I was in their skin, I was walking in their shoes, it was much harder to be judgmental of them and create a character who was, say, completely nefarious or problematic. There is one character, but that character doesn't have a voice and is based on a real person who was really nefarious. But that was great, because I think as a writer, you always have to find a way to love your characters and empathize with them insofar as you can. And when you're in their head and
Hmm.
really letting them explore why they're doing things. So, Madame Hobert, for example, Mademoiselle Hobert, she's a character who I might have been sort of judgmental of.
Hmm.
But she had this whole rationale for her understanding of truth and why you tell the truth and what you do. And, Alice Austen, the writer, don't necessarily agree with that, but I was able to explore it more fully in her head rather than just sort of, being critical of it. And
Yeah.
I think it's interesting to approach it that way.
I think us as readers have that same experience, right? Because if you just see her from the outside, we're going to make judgments of why she's saying the things she is or why she's doing it. But once we hear her voice, then it puts a little like, huh, on it to where we really have to dive in a little deeper. So I did appreciate that. But let's go ahead and get into Dirk because he is such an interesting character. It's one that we want to hate in a lot of ways or despise, but then he has like this bizarre twist, I would say, at the end. And there's no secrets here. We all have read the book. So talk a little
Okay.
bit about Dirk and how he surprised you.
Well, Dirk, naturally seems to be the character who was going to be villainous, who was going to fall for there was this complexity in Belgium because Belgium is divided between Flemish Dutch speakers and Flemish being a language closely related to Dutch, and French speakers, the Walloons. And they don't historically they've not gotten along, and it's been kind of a cobbled together society. And one of the things I felt I had to get right, it is fiction, but it's interesting to me that it became so soundly sort of categorized in the States as historical fiction. In Europe, it's literary fiction. But here it's very much historical fiction. And I think part of the reason for that is that I was meticulous about details because there were so many groups implicated. There's a Jewish population in Belgium. I had to get that right. I couldn't get that wrong. There's the Flemish population because there's a perception that the Flemish collaborated, the French did not. And of course, that's not true. And, it was very individual. And there was an incredible appeal, however, by the Germans to the Flemish, like to become part of the Germanic Brotherhood and sort of, part of that whole world. And so you would think Dirk might fall for that. But also, his experience at university, he was always watching and always sort of savvy and understanding how people played their cards and his own shortcomings, his parents or, you know, his mother's shortcomings, his poor, stepfather. Um, and I think he was always watching and always sort of savvy in a way that sort of kept him from completely falling for an ideology lock, stock, and barrel.
Mhm.
So he caught himself and he became aware of what was happening and he had loyalty. He had a great deal of loyalty to Charlotte, which I thought was really interesting, as I got to know him.
Yeah. Well, and Julian, because he mentions Julian was one of the few people that
Yes,
would say, hey, come outside with us and play, kind of
yes.
thing. But, it's still, even though he catches himself, you still wonder, is the money or almost the win of it gonna get him too? Like, I don't know that he ideologically would see the same as the Germans, but he is, to me, someone that could be just one of the ones that wants to end up on top regardless, kind of thing. And I wasn't for sure which way he was going to go with that.
No, and I think that's one of the things I explored and one of the things I'm fascinated by because I think we all have this idea of ourselves as to who we would be and how we would behave. But when you're put in circumstances and extremists, I think none of us know, not as clearly as we'd like to think. Like, would we risk our families for someone else's children? Would we risk our own lives? Would we fall for the money, right? It's I think when you're confronted, that I think that's what art does when it's, sort of its most powerful is you see people who are confronted with these questions and decide and make their moves.
Well, I want to talk a little bit more about Charlotte because she is such a fascinating character. You decided to make her colorblind, which I found so, I don't know, just on the point for so many things throughout this book. Talk about that decision and how it really shaped this novel.
So I had heard of someone who was completely colorblind, who had then gone on. and been an important person in the world of textile and fabric and color selection. And I thought, wow, that's unbelievable. That's fascinating. So I started doing some research. And because it's different from, people who have like red-green color blindness. I have family members who have that,
Mhm.
but you still see color. And this is the absolute color blindness. Sometimes it's accompanied by other deficits, but there are all these people who are doing fascinating artistic things. They see the world very differently. And and so I thought, wow, this is so interesting to have a character who sees everything in shades of gray, because one of the things that happens when there are dramatic ideological divisions in a society is people have this black and white perspective. My side is God, your side is the devil. And here's this woman who, from the beginning, sees everything in gray, in
Mhm.
grayscale. So for me, that was very interesting to write, and it was an enormous challenge. I didn't know how difficult it would be. My mother's an artist and a painter, and I grew up with a very strong appreciation for color and design and pattern and color as it feeds into all of those things. And I'm a filmmaker, and colors, I'm really particular about the palette and the, coloring. And I've gone through the process of coloring a film with, brilliant people in Paris who are some of the best colorists in the world. And it's such a fascinating process. And I didn't realize the degree to which my brain relies on color. You're writing and you're like, the words come to mind of how you describe the sky, of how
Yeah.
you describe, a vista, and what a crutch color can be in a way. So that was, with Charlotte, every time I'd have to catch myself and be like, oh, nope, nope, she doesn't see that.
Yeah.
Or that's
Well,
not how she sees it, rather.
right. And I think she made such an impression on all the characters or all the people in the building that she touched and met, because constantly they were referring to how she would see something or how she would perceive it. And it shows how much of an impact she made on everyone in that building. I thought it, and I loved that Shades of Grey because it was so metaphorical. It was so perfect. But I thought to myself, even she catches her father and says, "Dad, you can say that the grass is green." Like, I know you're trying to hold back, but
Right,
it's
right.
just
It's
like,
okay. You can say you're not going to offend me. You're not going to hurt
right,
me. Yeah.
exactly. All right, let's go ahead and move a little bit on to the building itself. So, 33 plus Brugmann, it's in itself its own character. I believe you even say it's a she, the place is a she at some point. So I wanted to talk about it and the human characteristics that you've given this building, and how architecture sort of plays into this, because we do have some architecture professionals in this novel as well.
Well, so in Belgium, there's this incredible tradition of design and artistry, and so many great artists have come out of that part of the world from, some of the great Dutch artists, the Bruegels, Magritte, Matisse. And you go through and they're Delvaux, who I have a great affinity for. And and then there are the architects. The Art Nouveau tradition came largely out of Belgium, Victor Horta, and this idea of creating buildings that sort of connected to nature. And there's this question, and it's something Havel talked about a lot, that the art of fascism wasn't good art. And so it's that deep connection of design and how it shapes how we live and how we think about the world. And so all of those things I was trying to bring in, but I wasn't going to talk about them sort of in the abstract. And then Francois is an architect, Charlotte's father. So he was able to voice a lot of those things and talk about the importance of communication and how communities and the way they're built shape how we communicate. And that's something, I was in Sicily last year. And Sicily is this remarkable island where I'm sure some of you have been there, where you see Greek, Roman, Norman, Italianate, Bourbon, like these
The
sort
melting
of
pot. Mhm.
periods. And then there are these sort of modern kind of haphazard parts of it where like there'd be tall buildings, a gas station right in the freeway, and people live there. And and what really struck me is how the modern version of how we live doesn't share anything in common with every single prior version, which had to do with the centralized place where people gathered and places where they ate and shopped. And even in Roman times, there were these central
Mhm.
places. There are these extraordinary mosaics. Like there's this whole, one of the largest mosaics that still exists. And you can see that and how important communication and connection was socially. And and I think that's what happens in a time of occupation. That's cut off, and intentionally so. So it's like to me, it's very interesting thinking about the future,
Right.
right? And how we live in the future with regard to those questions of society and how we remain connected when we're increasingly disconnected.
Well, and I think when you mentioned COVID at the beginning, I think that was a little bit of a wake up call for all of us too. Like, how
Yeah.
connected really are you? And how easy is it for you to be able to sustain a community when you are in that lockdown mode? It is fascinating. It was interesting though with Leo because his daughter even recognized that he started to retreat inside of himself into his sketchbook and into this um, almost magical realism world where the architecture and the nature could not separate. He just wanted to be in the space. Talk a little bit about that and why that was important for him to have that be his journey.
I think the characters find different ways of continuing to hope and continuing to sort of act insofar as they can. And I think that was, the painter Delvaux, I referred to it just a little bit, but he actually, stopped selling paintings. He could just kind of retreated and all of a sudden his paintings were populated with skeletons. And it's so difficult because you don't necessarily run out into the street and just like shoot the Nazis, or what can you do? You don't have the capacity to do that. So I think it was his way of continuing to work and continuing to hope for a better world in the future. And it was sort of his, almost his rebellion.
Well, and it was one of the things that sort of ended the novel in that when
Hmm.
she sees the sketchbook and she's sitting exactly where he was, and he has drawn the sketchbook of everything in it, like that circle that just keeps going. I thought that was a one of the most hopeful ways you could have ended this book because it does show that it doesn't stop. It was a really
Right.
poetic way to do that. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about the family that goes the which I thought was clever with the paintings, but why you had them obviously up and leave in the night. We find that out because they would not have been able to later. But why did you decide to take the narrative out of this building and go beyond the borders into the war? Like you took Masha to Paris and you took them on to England and beyond.
So this happened, and I it was inspired as well by stories I knew. I had a relative who was British, actually, who was in the OSS, and then I had a colleague who, and both of those were inspirations for the minor character Guy in the book, who and my colleague had fled Belgium and gone to England and joined the OSS as well, the spy, the British spy um, office of, well, anyway, it was like their wartime spies. And these people were extraordinarily brave. And And then there were a number of Belgians who went to England and flew with the RAF. The story of Longchamp is actually a true story, uh, which is, when I thought of that story a lot because my office was on Avenue Louise, and there's a small sort of memorial to Longchamp, and where, in a plaque that says this was formerly the Nazi headquarters. And he really did do that. And what's fascinating about Longchamp, so he was a Belgian aristocrat, and he flees because the Belgians, they just couldn't fight the Germans, and and this is wonderfully, I love that you did this on May 17th, because this is the date of the occupation of Brussels by the Nazis. And so Longchamp got over there, and he's in the RAF. And he didn't tell anyone he was doing this because he didn't want anyone to get in trouble. And there was some sortie, and they had bombed something in the Netherlands, I think, so fairly close by. And he had printed up all these pamphlets that were like, free Brussels, free Belgium. And he just took off and flew solo over Brussels, successfully bombed the Nazi headquarters, flew along Avenue Louise, and dropped the pamphlets in this park where I spent a lot of time, and everyone who had children spent a lot of time in Brussels, and then flew back to England. He was actually reprimanded. He was not, awarded for doing that because it was against orders, and
Right.
but then he went on to be awarded for his bravery, and then he died in the war, sadly. But this happened. People left. Also, for me, it was great to have, and I knew of a Jewish family who had done this, who had left and gotten out in time, and who had said, "Okay, we have to leave now." And there were people who did that, and we don't hear those stories enough, or of people who were fighting, and it was, the novel has been read a great deal by Jewish communities around the world, and that has been very warmly received, in terms of, like, we there were people who were doing that as well. So it's interesting to hear those stories too.
You talked about this center of communication or these societies that have always been set up with this centrality. But then during the novel, there was this talk of how do we have a sense of peace or belonging, and it was public art. And so when he has the idea that, hey, we need to bring art back into view of the, was this something that really happened? And if so, I assumed it was. And then the thing like, hey, let's write in to vote which piece it's going to be. And I started
That
thinking
was
about how
real.
important that really was. And I just wanted to hear
Yeah,
about this.
that was real. So, there's a lot written about how the British were so stalwart and stayed in London through the bombing, and the royal family stayed in London, and Churchill, everybody was like, and Churchill did say the paintings can't leave. They did hide them in the Welsh mine, true, and they did use the Cadbury, uh, we call them trucks, but yeah, they used those to get the paintings in and out, which I thought was absolutely hilarious. And so English, I'm half English, so I was like, yes, I love that. But yeah, the idea of having, you know, art and taking the risk. Okay, one painting might get destroyed, but we are preserving our society. We are not acquiescing. And ultimately that was part of, I think, how the English sustained, you know, the RAF fighters, the statistics, Julian talks about that a little bit, were just dire. Like the odds of coming back from a sortie were like 25%. They were just terrible. So there was this extraordinary courage and, sort of will to not acquiesce. And I think that was part of it. And it's interesting to consider what role art plays in society, and why, why art matters.
Well, then you also go into, there was a conversation about how the world infects art and it's meant to discriminate. Can you talk about this to us a little bit? Because to me, I was thinking, I wanted to hear more on that.
So. It's a really interesting question, and right now I'm following the Cannes Film Festival. I have a lot of friends who are there now, and hope to be there again with the film, and because it's a remarkable place to be. And there's a great discussion going on about whether politics belong in art, whether politics have any place in art. And it's a really powerful discussion. Ken Loach, the English filmmaker, is talking about it. He's 90, and I think he has had more films. He's had 16 films at Cannes and won 3 Palme d'Or. And Javier Bardem just weighed in, and everybody, it's a very tricky time to talk about these things because people risk their careers to do so. And what happened during the Nazi era, you look at the art and you look at what happened during the Soviet era, and at the point at which there were great novels, and then which was before the Soviet era, and then there were the sort of officially condoned novels, none of which, or to my mind, they don't have as much lasting
Right.
uh, power by a long stretch. And then there were these books that began to be written, the Samizdat, or the books that began to be written that were forbidden and that were banned. Master and Margarita, great example. I think it was published many years after his death. So the question of how resistance can make art powerful and interesting and compelling, and how when a political system defines what art is and can be, how it constrains it and it makes it very particular. You get sort of a different kind of architecture. You get, the art that was very like blocky and very sort of like this is how it is, this is what we do, and you lose a certain kind of freedom. And I think art is very inspiring to people. It's one of the things that tells us that that we have a soul.
Alice, will you hold your cover up and tell us about
Yes.
this? Which country is this from?
So this is Germany, and this just came out this year. And I'm getting wonderful notes and feedback and reviews by German bookstores and critics. I have a few versions here. The book has uh, came out in Portugal, Edition de Seuil in France, published the French version that also was in Belgium, and the Figaro Littéraire, which is sort of it's where you really would love, if you're a writer, to have a review in France, did a banner with a photograph, extraordinary review of the book, which was really so mattered a great deal to me. It has come out in Dutch. It was published by Bloomsbury in London and was Hashard's Book of the Month, and got beautiful reviews in the Observer and Spectator and everywhere. And then it's coming out in Spain shortly, and I just approved the cover, which is different again, but a variation on the theme. And then whoops, it's coming out in Italy, I think next, like in 27, and
Okay.
in Japan. And yeah, so
It's exciting. I mean, it just has sort of this rollout that just keeps happening, which I think is really nice. And I do like this cover, and I like that it's kept even in Germany. And I'm sure some of the other countries will have it, but it does feel of a play. Like I do feel like this could still be, when we can get more funding back into the arts, that this could really fit on, for a play. I really do. But
well, it's interesting because I've been approached about that by a director who recently has reached out and said, would you be interested in doing that? And then there's the question of film, and we've been talking about that, and some discussions are in process. And then there's the question of would it be a film or would it be a limited series? And so all of those things are kind of percolating right now.
work in so many formats. Do you think that it fits better in one or the other, or is it just such a creative process that you feel like it could flow into any of these and don't really
It
want to
could
close?
flow into any, it depends, it really depends on the collaborators you're working with and uh, the people who do the work, I mean, I'm, I think of the limited series that I thought were extraordinary. I thought like the Chernobyl series was unbelievably wonderful.
Mhm,
Um, and so it would depend. I think it would have to be a kind of European centric group to
mhm.
get it right. That's my instinct. So,
I had the opportunity to interview Rachel Joyce, and she's
ah,
turned books. I love Rachel Joyce, first of all. I'm a huge
yeah.
fan. But I so wanted to see her work as a screenwriter, to see her bring it there as well.
And I
But
think, did her play just win an Olivier? Her play was, she just did a play,
yes,
a version of one of her books, and I think it won an Olivier, didn't it? For musical maybe
did
or
it?
something?
Oh, that's
Yeah.
exciting.
Yeah.
First of all, I loved the book. If y'all haven't read Rachel Joyce, all of it is good. Um, but I do want to ask you some rapid fire questions, and I know there may be some people that want to ask you a question, so this is to get you ready. Okay. Are you ready, Alice?
Yes.
Okay. Most beautiful street in Europe.
Oh, in Europe. Oh gosh. Um,
Do you want to narrow it down to Brussels?
well, if it's Brussels, it's Avenue Le Poutre.
Okay.
Yes.
All right. Here's an interesting one from the
Okay.
book. Does cream taste grassy or sweet?
Ah, I think it depends on what the cows are eating.
What's your favorite cake?
I think chocolate.
Shoes off or on when inside?
Off.
Your favorite Rembrandt painting?
Oh, maybe self-portrait.
Fishing or philosophy?
I have a hard time with both of them. I grew up in one of those fly fishing families in the West and spent a lot of time fly fishing, and I'm not an avid fly fisherwoman, even though I know how to fly fish. And I have studied philosophy and I have little patience for it, but it always creeps into my books.
I was
So
going to say, you have very
it's
much
a
a Charlotte.
tie.
Yeah, you're very connected to Charlotte on this, which I
Yes.
appreciated as well. Okay, last question. What's your preferred hat color?
Hat color. I have a great green. So there's a tradition of hat making in Belgium. And I have a green Elvis Pompilio hat. And it's this great green that you would see like in Florence, Italy. It's kind of, just the perfect, it's hard to describe, but it's like a muted green, but it's fabulous. And
Mhm.
Elvis Pompilio started designing hats, and he was part of the inspiration for the hats. Um, and all of a sudden, his hats were on every runway. And he had this tiny atelier that he opened in Brussels. And I was one of the early clients there. And I have this hat that, is just extraordinary. And you can make it in all kinds of shapes. And I think that year it was on the Paris, Milan, and like, less in New York because they weren't doing hats so much. But
Absolutely.
yeah. But it was just wonderful. It was like this extraordinary designer, and you could just buzz and walk right in on the roof
Oh,
of one Death Star. So,
how cool. You've crossed paths with so many wonderful human beings, it sounds like. All right, group, if y'all have a question, feel free to raise your hand and ask it. I'm going to keep asking questions until I see something. But something I did want to cover with you before I forget is the mystical part. I did talk a little bit about it with the drawing, but we didn't even go into the lioness part of this book.
right.
Can you talk a little bit about its meaning and why you wanted it to be a through point as well?
So it came into the book and those kinds of things. I mean, I do have a mystical sensibility with regard to dreams and imagery and so I give myself kind of free rein when I'm writing. And then there was the point, of course, when we were editing and everyone's like, oh, what is the lion? What is she? What is the lioness? What is the meaning? And we talked about it a lot, and everyone agreed that they loved her and and she was important. And I think in a sense she's this spiritual sort of symbol for Charlotte from Masha, for those who see her. And then, of course, there's a through line, and there's a through line to the art and to an ancient goddess. And but I think it was this idea of abstract symbols, of dreams. I had this idea as I was writing the book that people were having collective dreams. And then I thought, well, I'm just out of curiosity, I'm going to look that up. And I did, and it was true. People during the war were having collective dreams. Now, of course, people were hearing a lot of the same things. They were hearing about things that were happening, but it was kind of a bit deeper than that. And that was so interesting to me. So all of those things kind of became part of the book, the sort of mystical side of it.
Well, that Harry and Masha dream was very fascinating to hear. But now that I think more about the lioness, you also began the book with the cat getting hit in the
Right.
street and the blood, and then the blood comes in later on the street. And um, I think it's a sense of worry, but also comfort for her in a lot of ways and strength because it is there. And it comes right up to her face too, which I found extremely important for Charlotte. So I
Well,
thought it was
it's
beautiful.
interesting because the surrealist movement took a lot of it took hold in Belgium. There were a number of the early sort of proponents of it were Belgian. And so there's this question, and I've heard other writers talk about this, of magical realism versus surrealism versus, and I think when that's part of your DNA as a writer, you have to give that some space and let it breathe. And I write in a really unconscious way when I'm writing. I mean, I really do sometimes organize my work very meticulously, but then I let myself kind of write and let my unconscious sort of go. And so I don't think consciously I knew I was connecting the blood, the cat, the lioness, and I was, but it was on this completely other level, not a level where I'd been like, oh, I'm going to do that.
Yeah, it wasn't a plot point that you were
Mhm.
checking off as
No,
you went.
no.
So when you do have this, turning over of yourself into the writing, how do you defend that to an editor? Because at the beginning you said you have to hang on to what is truly that central part of the novel. And how, because it's not necessarily that plot point that you point to. So how do you have those conversations with
I,
editors,
well, I
publishers?
think that's where it's very important to have a great fit with an editor. And I worked with, well, first my wonderful agent, Dorian Karshmar, and then Elizabeth Schmitz at Grove and Allegra DeFenu at Bloomsbury. And we were all really on the same page and really were able to talk very directly and openly. And Elizabeth, who is at Grove, we had this wonderful thing in common because I studied creative writing under Seamus Heaney. She studied poetry as literature under Seamus Heaney at around the same time at Harvard. And we didn't know each other, but I think it's so interesting that we were, she was studying the other end of the whole, thing, and then we came together. So there was something quite magical in that.
Well, Robin has a question for you. She wants to know what your favorite treasure is on that bookcase right behind you. Do you have anything favorite on
On
there
my
that you want to
bookcase.
share with us?
Let me see. Yeah, you know what? I think it's this odd little statue that one of my kids gave me of a mother wolf and her cubs.
Oh,
And I think they gave it to me when they were really little. So it was
oh,
something they found.
yeah. That is so sweet. Well, um, you did mention that you're working on another book. Can you
Yeah.
tell us anything about that? Title
Yeah.
or sort of about?
So yeah, I'm quite far along actually. And I suppose you would call it a literary thriller. It has one narrator. There's one man. He's on this journey. And I said before that I'm fascinated by characters who find themselves in these difficult circumstances. And he finds himself on the run because of something he wrote and all sort of fighting for his life on that front, and then also on a completely different front that he hadn't anticipated. And it's set in New York and in Paris, and he has a wonderful dark sense of humor. As I've let him go, I'm like, okay, here you are. What are you going to do now? And it's been a very interesting process in no small measure because it's set 10, but something that happened in 18th century France informs the story as well. But inhabiting a world 10 years from now is a very particular challenge because so much is changing so quickly. And trying to understand where we are, it's like we can look around and say, oh, yeah, this is where we are, and we can write about that. But for me, it's a very interesting question to ask, okay, this is where we are, and then what?
Right.
Like, so where will we be? So that's been an incredibly interesting place to sort of inhabit for quite a while. I've the idea for the book and how I was going to approach it. I've been working with this for a really long time. So
I can't wait. I can't wait to see what you're doing with it, especially when you're bringing that dream, all the things into it that you bring in such a wide variety. And we're going to really appreciate it. Can you give us any books? I know you mentioned your friend who is your reader. Said you mentioned she has some short stories that should be coming out hopefully soon. Do you have any other
hopefully.
books or authors that you wanted to highlight?
Let me see. Well, I read what have I read recently that I loved? Yes, Alice Jolly's book, The Match Girl, is remarkable. And it's been published in the States, and I have blurbed that book, and it's a beautiful, beautiful book. Um, I'm reading right now, actually. I'm reading two books right now. Well, several books. I've got a lot of books. I'm I'm
That's okay.
reading
We all are like this.
I'm a great Anna Akhmatova fan. I adore her poetry, so I'm rereading her entire collection of poetry. I have on the calculation of volume four. So it's on the calculation of volume four, which is a very interesting book by Solveig Ball, who's a Scandinavian writer. This summer, my mother had green eyes, which
Okay.
is Tatiana Tibulak's book. And then I had the great, wonderful, wonderful time meeting Kiran Desai at an event. And I'm finally reading The Inheritance of Loss, which is quite beautiful and won the Booker, I think, 20 years ago.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much for sharing your bookshelf with us as well. This has such a great night of discussion and insight into your brain and your work and your life. We really appreciate you so much for coming. I'm going to try to get everybody to come back in a couple of weeks. June 1st, we're going to be discussing Sipsworth by Simon Van Buie. Following the loss of her husband and son, Helen Cartwright returns to the village of her childhood after living abroad for 6 decades. Her only wish is to die quickly and without fuss. She retreats until one cold night, a chance encounter with a mouse sets Helen on a surprising journey. Over the course of 2 weeks in a small English town, this reclusive widow discovers an unexpected reason to live. New York Times named it as a book that feels like a hug, and we all need a book that feels like a hug right now. So it's a very short book. I hope y'all can read that and join. And then 2 weeks after that, we're going to be celebrating Juneteenth with the Oprah Book Club author Nathan Harris for his newest book, Amity. So plenty of time to get that read. Um, I was so excited to talk to you, Alice. I'm so grateful for your time. But I have a little bit that I picked out of the novel that I'm gonna say back to you because I thought your words were so beautiful.
Thank you.
So, thank you for reminding us that even the tedious and not enjoyable talk needs to be beaten and aired out like laundry. And that is so true today. But at the same time, quote, if you're feeling flighty or worried, take off your shoes, stand on the earth, be naked, and understand that you are part of something bigger. That it is our ability to see beauty in what makes us human. But I'm like Charlotte, and I also believe that I think it is kindness, doing things for people even when they're doing nothing for you, not telling them you've even done it, that we should continue to include everybody, that it was the only way the world would become a better place. Now we can all raise our metaphorical glasses or ceremonial, and we're going to toast to a better end than we now see. Thank you so much, Alice. It was such
Thank
a
you.
beautiful read,
It
and
was
I'm
my
recommending it.
pleasure. Thank
Yes.
you so much.
Good luck with your new book, your new
Thank you.
plays, movies, all the things.
Thank you.
We can't wait to see what creative you bring us. And good night, everybody. And I'll see y'all in a couple of weeks. Thank you,
Thank
Alice.
you. Good night. Good
Have a
night.
good
Thanks
one.
so much. Bye bye.